welcome everyone to today's session. Very exceptional occasion. For me, a real pleasure to introduce our speakers, Jenny French and Angela Pang, who I know so well from teaching here over the years and whose work I have myself analyzed closely, in particular on the occasions when they have been participants in the MR2 Pro Seminar, where we undertake a kind of deep dive into the works of several of the faculty. Now, what we're doing in this session is something I think that's very interesting, trying to identify positions and doing it with practicing people who are touching on several of the same problems, but from very different perspectives. And I think you will see that today. And the idea is that each will present a series of projects, 3, but will volley back and forth, each presenting one, then the other. And this follows a kind of structuralist model of assessing one's work because it involves doing this with the idea that you're moving from the early to the late, the past, present, future. It's kind of the rudimentary substrate of, of structuralist analysis. I mean, sort of to introduce the idea of process and to identify either continuities or ruptures in one's own process, but then to do that by virtue of a parallel that's being established between the pairs of projects in the past and the present and future model. So now let me try to summarize. The two have done extraordinary work, and I can't summarize so well everything they have done, but I will tell you a little bit about each. Jenny is co-founder with Anda French, who is here today, of the practice French 2D. This is an interesting practice because it's integrated with a lot of the current problems that architects are facing in urban situations, and their work really demonstrates all of these questions about public identity, participation, how people are living today in cities, hybrid models. And I think combining this with a pedagogical strategy has been so important for Jenny, who has coordinated, designed the pedagogy, and particularly the 4th semester, but made tremendous contributions in our first year pedagogy. So many awards, so many projects that really are doing this effectively today. I'm not going to list those all. There are too many. It would take time, but I'd rather have you learn from them about their work and look at that yourselves. But I just want to emphasize her work as a designer who is thinking through pedagogy as well, this kind of integration of the two, which is also very clearly what Angela does. And this is unusual, I should say, because, to be invested to the extent these two are in a practice while committing themselves to developing pedagogy. This is a major undertaking. I'm sure you understand that. Now, Angela, co-founder of Pang Architect. Now, in this instance, we're talking about someone whose main emphasis really has been to look at very interesting new types of tectonic, material, and spatial innovations that can be generated through investigatory, a genuinely experimental practice. And you understand that the advancement of the repertoire, the language that we are working in at a time when it is driven arbitrarily by so many diverse impulses is very important pedagogically. What could constitute a language that can mean anything in this context? And I think by virtue of the way she roots it in tectonic investigation, she has found the means to cross, the spectrum of so many people's interests. This is what I love about it. Now, in each instance, there are innovations. I mean, the projects do this quite differently, one to the next. Again, I'm not going to list them all, but they are quite extraordinary works. And I think it's important to understand also that she's coming from another part of the world, obviously. A lot of the work in Hong Kong, this is jumping cross-culturally, in domains that are quite different, and recognizing the difference and the continuity in this question of practicing in different places in the world. This is as important as some of the kinds of questions that Jenny is looking at. So it's a very different set of problems when you're talking about an international, set of predicaments. Okay, there you have it. The floor is the two of yours, and after this we'll have a conversation with you two and the audience. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Scott, for that very lovely introduction. And it's been an incredible way to develop both practice and pedagogy as a kind of volleying back and forth, really kind of modeled after the longstanding pedagogy that I got to experience as a core student myself from you. So thank you for that. So Grace, when you're watching this on YouTube, if I had to start a journal right now with my sister and my partner, I think ours would be called Dispositions, right? And this is really that there's multiple kind of valences to this term. We could think about a quality of character, a habit, a preparation, a state of readiness, or really a tendency to act in a specific way. But it also can literally just mean the way something is placed in space. And so for us, disposition has been about a tendency to act on the ordinary, right? To think through just the things that are around us. We literally live in the same square mile where we were born and have kind of evolved with the city of Boston and a particular neighborhood as it faces a housing crisis, as any number of other crises, but always trying to think about what can we contribute in a kind of distanced way. So today, I'm going to present the sort of past, present, and future, nominated under these three terms: creatures, collectives, and new comforts. And the sort of practice of looking through and with and upon and back at the everyday, the ordinary, right? The terms tend to shift. Talk about the vaguely familiar, the canny and uncanny. For us now, coziness has been something we've been dealing with as it might relate to the body in particular. So creatures, collectives, new comforts. And to begin with creatures, I think this is really about the founding of our practice as a set of references and influences that I think are always returning to this figure, our kind of hero figure maybe of Alan Wexler. Right? Here he is as an architecture student at RISD with his ID shirt, sort of plainly, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of deadpan, and I talk a lot about the earnest versus the devious. I think Alan Wexler is humorous, but he is quite serious about engaging in a serial set of investigations about the ways that we work. And here he is with a set of cards, that are the answers of what do you do at a cocktail party, right? My work explores the other side of function, or he studied architecture at a time of crisis, right? The sort of seriality of these investigations are without prejudice, and he admits the freedom of being self-directed as different than the architect who can't always be self-directed. But sort of taking a page from this, right, some of our work can be seen as these sort of creatures that are a kind of long-form love letter to Alan Wexler, for lack of a better term, right? Here he is with a four-handled broom or cup that requires collaboration between people to make it work. Many-sided teapot, the unfolded drawing, for us also related to our own paper model drawing of a recent building, the kind of space that is anthropomorphized here in our version, the wall cozy in the hallway right before the pandemic, creaturely things caught between caryatids and tea cozies. Alan Wexler also importantly works on the idea of collective dining as something that produces reciprocity and community in real time. Here in two different pieces, Coffee Seeks Its Own Level and a tablecloth with 4 shirts sewn into it. And again, this sort of conversation might be in our 40-foot-long creaturely tablecloth, here seen in a model of an exhibition at UMass Amherst last year, or through an aerial in the backyard, as well as under the pavilion of KGVS last year. And this idea of the kind of creaturely is really about producing small-scale architectures that are communities that are ephemeral in real time, just as we're looking at things that are permanent or, permanent relative to the 2-hour event. So here, thinking about comfort as a literal blanket to create warmth, also working off of a series of spatialized dinners that created a kind of theater on Boston City Hall Plaza. And this work, I think, is also where one of the other clear influences comes from, right? My own Core 1 instructor, Michael Meredith, and thinking about the kind of permission that Moss's practice gives the kind of combination of the commissioned and the self-directed work. So here's just a screenshot of their website, right? There's objects, there's low-res quilts, there's housing. So I think that this kind of combination and again, the kind of permission to work in all of these ways is really extraordinary. So here we see one of their earliest projects right underneath the Carpenter Center, a puppet theater. They also, of course, had a hairy, snuffleupagus-looking proposal for a MoMA PS1 that many of my friends helped build. Here is our own finalist proposal in 2012 for a furry set of set pieces constructed out of simple pallets and unistrut. But their practice, of course, is also deeply about the kind of pragmatics of housing, the profile, the figure, simple forms of wood construction, and the kind of flatness that acknowledging how elevations and cuts form buildings. So the kind of creature building then that I'm going to talk about is this project, the Outlier Lofts. It is one that produces a kind of sawtooth character that's intentionally navigating the edge of a very strange situation across a whole sea of transit lines, 93, the Orange Line, and then paired with a side elevation in the historic neighborhood of Charlestown. So this sort of creature for us has an identity that persists over time. Right? Here is an overlay of our historical fiction plus the past lives of the building when it was a row house. It lost its 3rd floor in a fire, became this no-name bar featured in Ben Affleck's The Town as a set. And when the bar owners wanted to sell it, it became reimagined from row house into 3 flats designed by us with this kind of industrial gable, the move between an industrial sawtooth and a kind of mansard roof as it turns the corner. And so these overlays were really about the kind of collapse of both time and a kind of permission to rethink a stranglehold on historical references. We've also done work in Nantucket that will frankly never show because the historical commission was so upset by the work of Robert Venturi, let's say, that you can't do anything that a whale captain wouldn't have built, 200 years ago. So the building then has this sort of cartoonish, for us, embodiment of thing, right? It's not quite anthropomorphized, but it's there every day as we both drive home. And for the interior of it, right, we also started thinking about the kind of inanimate objects as having secret lives, right? So here, instead of photographing a project staged, because this was a spec building, right? It didn't have a client with the world's best furniture and art collection. We instead used real photographs with virtual staging where chair characters that played out its 200 years of history, as well as this sack of potatoes, because it was along a potato shed lane, started to inhabit the building, including the bar stools, or the kind of contrapposto of furniture that itself is the occupant Right. I will leave it for the next.
Thank you, Jenny. First of all, thank you, Scott, for the wonderful introduction. You know my work better than I do. The other people I would like to thank is Grace and Andrew for inviting us, Jenny and I, to do this together. I'm honored to be sharing the stage with Jenny.
I'm so sorry. Right, the same. Yes.
No, of course. And so I want to acknowledge the work that you will see is a collective effort from a lot of people who gave a lot to the office. I also want to say that the office name, Pang Architect, the Pang doesn't refer to me, but actually refer to my father, who enlightened me to go into architecture. And of course, I should thank my husband, Sang, and my children who put up with me for all this stuff that I do. But the first thing I want to share with you is the first project I worked on after graduating from the GSD. This is the RISD Chase Center. I was at Monet's office. I was given a stack of DD drawings, no idea what that is, and then I was told to make a model. And so I spent 2 months alone, which I loved it. Just constructing this model that was maybe, I don't know, 3/4 size of the size of this table, 1/4 inch. Every step, every cornice, every pendant was cut. The inside, the facade can come out. We could take pictures of the inside. So the image on the right is actually a photograph of the model. And I learned tremendously from this exercise, and I'm so grateful for this. I learned, so for example, if you look at the image on your right, that slot between the glass box and the brick box, it's actually the skylight, the clear story light that brings into the interior space that you see on your left. And so from that, I learned design has consequences. When you make a line on an elevation, it has meaning. It creates light, it creates scale, it creates space. And so the project is tremendously difficult and challenging because of the sectional differences. And it has forever held a very warm, soft spot in me for that. So you see that staircase actually really does connect to the upper museum level. I can share more on another occasion. This is then this is actually the center spot of that photograph is where my seat was at the Santa office. Another experience that I could just not be more grateful for. I learned from this what it means to be dedicated, to be focused, and to be full of sort of conviction in what you do. And so I try, and aside from the many design things that I've learned through that experience, I try to bring that into my own practice in the beginning of time, at least when I was younger and had more energy. This is when we first started in Hong Kong, literally in an empty space that we found from my parents. And this was the first project that I was fortunate enough to be working on. This is the moment when I was given the site. This is like a really sort of dark basement, except for these two big skylights, at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, at the University Library. And when I saw this, I thought, construction was going really heavily, and the waterproofing was all wet and muddy on the ground, and I was stepping around getting my new shoes dirty. And then I thought, what can we do with this basement conditions? And so this is what I did. This is shortly after it opened. This is not a rendering, by the way. I wanted to, okay, so it's a huge basement with a very big space. The thing that my client, the head librarian, said, I asked them, what is it that you want? So this is a 24/7 study space. It opens 24 hours every day. And the only thing she said was table. And so I thought, for me, it was important to think about how to bring the light into in the basement condition, and bring nature into what should be a pleasant study space. And when the space is so large, it's actually I think, 3,000 square meters, so 30,000 square feet. What do you do with tables? And so I decided I was going to make the longest table on Earth. And I actually Googled, what's the longest table? Except my client was like, how do you go from one side to the other? You can't, so you have to cut it. So we ended up doing 2 tables, but really long ones. And at the end of it are the skylights, where it brings in the light, and it has a mound, like what I call the mound. So the light filters through this. So the tectonics of that, the structure of that was actually quite utilitarian, I guess I would use the word. And so I wanted to create a veil under the skylight and catch this light with this layering of light and shadows. And so this is where the skylight comes down to the mount. People lean on it, sleep on it. A part of that table also goes up and down in height, and it also varies in width. So the idea was that anybody could find a spot where they want. If they want a larger table, if they want of different height, they can find their fit. Chronologically, I do want to highlight that this is before Grace Farm, and so you can see that. You can see that it's really funny what you as an architect envision, and then what people decide to do. So on the left is a floating monk, Buddhist monk, doing meditation workshop. In the middle is like an exhibition, fair, trade, whatnot with the library, and then on the right is the university student crew team, like just decided to practice there. So, which is this is so where kind of my practice started.
And we didn't prepare this, so we had 2 tables, table and table. Excellent. Okay, all right. So my present, and really whenever I say I really should be saying the royal we with my partner, and who's in the audience. And it's really, we are an office of 2, so this is part of our strangely, with the occasional, like Allison right here, someone helping build a model or do, something, a drawing. So, collectives. This idea of collectives is not just, and we had Niraj Bhatia yesterday of the open workshop, and I asked maybe a provocation at the end of, are we sick of the collective? And I think not. But collective is both collective housing, which is the project I'm going to show, but also a way of reframing how architectural objects have to collapse multiple point of views onto a single thing, right? We don't have, neither my partner or I have depth perception, the stereoscope on the left, therefore doesn't work, and instead this, again, kind of creature to carry through that first part of this talk, the Kaiser panorama of Auguste Firmin, on the right, is instead this sort of object that allows the consolidation or the multiplicity of a collective vision. So similarly, right, this object here seen in a elevation oblique, again, dealing with the kind of flatness that comes from literally not seeing depth, is this 30-unit co-housing project in Malden, Mass, called Bay State Co-Housing. We started working on this project in 2016, and I think it's been a kind of gift that keeps on giving, thinking through so many aspects of both our practice, reconciling our education, right, the ways that an open courtyard building could be seen in a kind of collective form sense, right? And I just made my students read investigations in collective form ahead of Niraj's new investigations. Could be seen as an object as well as a kind of aggregation. This was also an incredibly long participatory design model. It involved like 15 all-day workshops with residents. Here's one where they're divvying up fragments of floor plans as well as reference images and the requisite Post-it note, but here trying to have people read the character of a physical model as something that they would respond to or not, so a kind of education also for clients. And so over a course of 6 years, we worked through the kind of construction of the community through a series of artifacts, large-scale models and drawings, to have a building that does many things at once in this strange site that's caught between being urban and among sort of single-family houses. And so it's an open courtyard, a kind of incomplete courtyard that starts to terrace up as it goes. I know the screen is probably not the best to see some of these floor plans. Only 3 stories tall, with a full underground garage underneath a raised terrace at its center. And so the coordination of this building has, an incredible amount of pressure, opinions, thoughts all on it. And here we see the kind of terrace section that is emblematic of how this building builds up. Co-housing is kind of, I jokingly say, like a condo commune. It's 30 households of residents, around 70 occupants, and they all have independent living units as well as large common facilities that they call the common house. So typically in rural places, this is like the mess hall of a camp. Here, in an urban object, the building is a kind of large single house and a pile of these objects, or a pile of these common house spaces. So this is a cut through the center of the courtyard, stacking both common terraces and large-scale dining, media rooms, music rooms together. And so this open courtyard then has its more regular section at the top where exterior walkways allow for a building that has very minimal double-loaded corridor and is almost always confronted with a kind of outdoor space or a view. And then in this long section, the terracing and stepping that goes from the street to the interior of the community. This building was designed during, interestingly enough, a construction moratorium that began in 2015 in the town of Malden, which was a reaction exactly, and maybe the red arrows are a little hard to see, exactly against all of the 5/2 typical boxy multifamily housing that was built just on the other side of this MBTA Orange Line stop. And you see our project in the foreground. So essentially, when the moratorium ended, they had actually effectively downzoned the entire neighborhood. And so the project almost stalled out multiple times and was only possible through collaboration with a city councilor who had actually lived in a co-op at Berkeley as an undergrad. And together we wrote a new ordinance for the town of Malden that stipulated that a kind of modest amount of density could be possible if it was occupied by residents who had a written agreement, right? Basically putting in an ordinance that this had to be an intentional community, that it had to have collective spaces indoor and out that would accommodate most of its residents. So this is kind of instrumental in making then the building possible, which is again a coordination on a very tight budget, right? This was $260 a square foot. So if you know what construction budgets are, this was very low. An interior courtyard, again, that has this sort of multiplicity of stacking views. And from the rear, right, also taking advantage of the idea that a series of cascading platforms and lawns and decks get to a below-grade garden level. And again, part of the kind of character of this project is through the selection of scale. So this is all hardy plank siding, right, at a few different exposures, 10-inch at the front, 7-inch at the back, paint colors and windows that start to produce these kind of compositional overlays. On the interior, a dining room for 100 people and a kitchen for 20, right, look onto each other through these kind of relationships that start to allow for mutual awareness, not just in the courtyard, but across all of the collective spaces. So this is the main stair at the front of the building, connected to a kid's room right underneath it. Or the dining room looking onto a living room that residents also wanted to be able to use as a kind of stage, and back at that kitchen. Here, noticeably, I mean, we're really interested in the kind of post-occupancy life of this, right? We're invested in this group. This is this felt acoustic ceiling that is the major pain point of many co-housing communities that are urban, that it's too loud, and so that, so amazed to visit and see that the kind of performance and the intention of some of these spaces is really living out its expectations. And so at the back of the building, this is, again, a kind of aggregated set of gable forms that wrap and then kind of sit on a busy street with a bus stop right in front. And again, play with the kind of game of scale of, does this 35-foot building start to read as a single house, an outsized house, a rambling kind of mansion for many. And some of this conversation was literally about the kind of transposition of scale between common house elements, again, a giant dining room, versus unit as a kind of analog for room itself. And this project also came directly out of an earlier project, which was 180 units of compact living, our first project that made us go from kind of club to business, actually. This is one of those units. It's a 300-foot by 50-foot adaptive reuse that was 4 stories of wood construction on top of 2 stories of an existing portal frame garage. And a view into both the unit, leveraging an alleyway as a kind of community courtyard that in many ways is analogous to this courtyard, though co-housing in the sort of trajectory of following the promise of compact living that, as our students in Core 4 know, has obviously been swallowed by a kind of commodification of housing as real estate. So very interested in the lessons of what self-financed intentional living can do for form as well.
It's nice that we have this sequence because actually I'm also showing a residential project as the next project. And some of you may have seen it in a different occasion. This is the area photo of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, same university of where the first past project was. You can see the main thing that is to read out of this photograph is the mall that's in the center. And the upper campus on your left, where that's where my project is, where that green scaffolding is showing on the photograph. So it's located right from sort of in the junction between the lower campus and the upper campus. This is the site model, and you can see the original site boundary is just the top level, but in the process of exploring the site, I found this unused piece of land. Anyway, if this is a laser pointer, I'll be shooting there, showing you where that lower platform is. So the project cascade down through the section. This is okay, well, let's look at the site plan, because site is always important, right? So you can see at the lower level along the mall is a long, sort of brutalist, modernist campus that was built in the 60s. And then at the upper level of the plan, is a cluster configuration. So what I try to do is to really integrate between the cluster and the long scale of the campus. This is the ground floor plan. You can see the residential, this is a housing, by the way, this is a student dormitory for 300 students. Land is precious in Hong Kong, so the double loaded corridor was not something that we tried, but it wasn't something that we could do anything about. So what we try to do is to think about the common spaces. And so you see from the top of the plan entering is the entrance hall, which leads to the multipurpose hall, and then to upper level with the staircase going up are the shared common spaces. In section, it shows this curious cantilever that's intentional. So by the manipulation of the stacking and the shifting in plan, it also does the same in section in order to negotiate between the lower level of the platform versus the upper level, that is New Asia College. And you can see from the section, you enter from the north side of the site, from the entrance hall up to the sort of secondary common spaces, and then from which you go into your residential part. And we did a lot of studies how to negotiate the scale, because from the south side, looking from the mall, the university mall, you're actually looking into some really large buildings. But if you're looking from the north side, from the New Asia campus, it's actually much more of a smaller human scale, like 2 stories, 3-story buildings. So that's the reason for this sort of very different appearance on the north and the south, although they're all made of just very simple blocks intentionally. The other thing that we really wanted to do was to use the cantilever in a meaningful way. On the first point is to disrupt the landscape. And the second point is to whether or not there's a chance to frame the passage from the lower campus to the upper campus at New Asia College. And so this is how it ended up being constructed. This is a 13-meter cantilever, and you can see the rhythm coming off the residential, the dormitory block, and framing that path at the bottom without disrupting the mountain, the beautiful trees. Looking from the other side, that's how sort of creating a portal, almost like an entrance gateway through this landscape passage that exists to link from the lower mall to New Asia College. And this rhythm is brought into the residential part of the project, where the gentle curvature intentionally tries to sort of, manipulate the corridor to create some sense of rhythm. And also to attribute to one of my heroes, Shinohara, the idea of a threshold and how the structure actually defined this threshold of which one enters from the common space into the more private quarters of the dormitory. And therefore, this is the multipurpose hall, and sort of bringing in the landscape from the site when it is not being used as a functional space. Is meant to be a yard, similar to Harvard Yard. That's how I conceive that this volume. And so the shifting in plan creates this courtyard in the middle, climatized courtyard for the students, of which then we have the semi-private, semi-public play space and study spaces for the students once you enter onto the first floor, ground first. So therefore here would be second floor. And seeing how those blocks extends into the interior, you can see on the left-hand side, one of the blocks kind of comes into to the entrance area. And so this is the view from the north side, and you can see that that the volumes are meant to be much more sort of human scale. The glass is, because it's the north side, we could use glass generously, allowing people to really see through into the multipurpose hall and the entrance hall. So from the street side, it's quite transparent. This is the view that I've always wanted to frame through the cantilever, through the stacking of the boxes. Again, is how do you sort of create that experience of the horizon through the building, and to bring in these language of the tectonics also into the appearance of the exterior. This is the facade. This is actually a real photograph. You can see the imperfections in the staircases on the right through the window. And so this serves also as a sun shading to prevent, because it's very hot in Hong Kong, so to prevent the direct sunlight hitting the concrete. Just endless studies to make this work, because this mesh, if you haven't noticed, is actually structural because it's sort of connected. There's no kind of frame behind it. So went through a lot of studies for many different things, and you can see actually from this view, this is from the south side, that the elevation is very different. That's much more opaque. But the multipurpose hall in the center is largely under shade. That is part of the sort of passive, consideration. Like how do we then shade the glass without, using a lot of energy? And so that's also part of the purpose of this sort of shifting between plan and section.
Okay. I like this parody. Excellent. Okay, so the last section that is about a kind of projection forward, I'm entitling New Comforts. And this was in no small part helped by thinking through this essay that Toshiko asked me to write about our work for the November issue of Domus that she edited, entitled Temporal. And so the title of this was New Comforts Await, and was really about picking up on where a kind of conversation on comfort might land us in 2024, right? So the show at the Guggenheim Lab that was in both Berlin and Mumbai and New York in 2011, right when I was finishing graduate school, addressed comfort in a way that was about a kind of urban set of interventions, looking at, even for example, in the lecture series, Liz Diller talking about ways that you might feel comfortable smoking on a sidewalk in New York. Right? So the kind of spectacle might have transformed into then a conversation in 2019, and this is me zooming way ahead. There was also a pinup issue titled Comfort, but Daniel Barber talks about, apologies, after comfort. My students are all aware of this, as our studio is really grappling with some of these same ideas, thinking about the kind of reliance on the interior conditioned environment as being essentially directly responsible for our impending discomfort in the climate crisis. And lastly, if a kind of set of human social comforts are actually the deciding factor, right? Do you want to turn your air conditioning off? If you're my in-laws in Charlotte, North Carolina, the answer is no, right? So we can have all of the technological innovations, to solve the problem of our climate crisis and our reliance on fossil fuels, but without understanding these sort of basic questions that Alan Wexler brings up of how are we going to operate together in this edited version of the everyday is essential. So new comforts also then relates to these other ideas that we've been kind of grappling with, seen in a show from last year entitled House Clothes, which was looking specifically at how textiles and housing might find a strange interface. So here on the left you see a model, this is a model of the show at UMass, our dresses that we made for a 26,000 square foot drawing over in Kendall Square, that the kind of idea of textile as building, as well as literal textile patterns, thinking about the facade as a form of garment. So we basically created models and garments to think about the scale of housing, the 3 unit, the 30 unit, and the 180 unit. So here you see a kind of performative skin that has no performance, right? Really a drawing in a gauzy fabric over a plexiglass model. And this has evolved for us thinking about garment and the kind of analog between dressing the body, thinking about layered dressing, kind of urban overcoat, the number of YouTube channels around wall sections and these sort of very dry understandings of insulation actually often just refer to the outer envelope as we move between cavity insulation to rain screens and exterior insulation as a kind of puffy jacket, right? So what did we do? We redressed that Outlier Lofts project with the help of Nikki Rhodes, who's maybe in the audience, and Chloe, and then some sewing skills, and thought about, once again, recycling this fabric that we made for the lobby and a literal kind of puffy jacket. So this is just, it's kind of a provocation, thinking about the adjustment of the envelope and the inhabitation of a wall section as something that we need to question as an alternative to the kind of high-performance hermetic thermos bottle that is the trend of passive house construction. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think the kind of questioning of a closed envelope versus an adjustable one is what is at the core here. So this also, of course, produces a kind of affect and scalelessness, right, where the garment then seen as draped over in successive layers, this familiar, at least to us, building. The building that I showed is the first project. Has a kind of strange reciprocity as we revisit that first project and the ways in which a facade literally telegraphs an attitude towards its neighborhood. And here in particular, this is a small project that we're calling Hindsight House, a single family ground up construction that's actually the replacement of a demolished old row house as part of urban renewal, and a lot that, even though the neighbors are certain shouldn't be built on, the city of Boston and Michelle Wu are very welcoming of the idea that such lots should be developed on. So what did we do? In a neighborhood where everyone wanted just a copy-paste of the rows to complete this sequence, it's an end, so it once again has a corner. We thought instead about this type seen on the right, the Garrison Colonial, which has a kind of strange overhang, kind of like a layered garment again, which is again a derivative of the historical Garrison type seen on the left. So we created a kind of double garrison for this lot, and here you see the Sanborn map showing that there in fact was a building there. So here in the depth of the wall section, right, again, seeing how can we get the framing of this to not be excessive, but to do a few steps in its wood construction to produce shadow line and the kind of affect that a series of layers have been draped over this wood building, while also thinking about a kind of version of preservation that isn't locked in that Nantucket historical reenactment, but is maybe a kind of like fan fiction of history. Yeah. There's the model of it. So this also interestingly had faced another approvals hurdle, and as it was being designed, Boston allowed for buildings with under 6 units to not have parking. So this we first designed with a full drive-in parking space at the ground floor, kind of ruining a lot of the viability of this house. And now, as it was trying to be blocked by a neighbor who thought their view was being blocked, which is very interesting, but I think a long conversation, it is now totally as of right, which is sort of shocking within existing zoning terms. So, Angela, I will pass it to you.
Thank you. So the future, actually, it's interesting to look at the future because I mean, it's a process of challenge and struggle, but I want to talk about a seminar, how my work, my own research also integrate with a seminar that I taught at the GSD last fall, and also is an ongoing research that's been since a couple of years ago at different institutions. This is a a series of experimentation models by Somaye. She was looking into Sendai Media Tech and the Taichung Opera House. And so you notice from picture 1 and 3 that they represent different support system, right? One that is just vertical columns and the other one has diagonals. And so what we do in the seminar and the research is try to discover ways of which we can generate interesting form that what I called rational, but I understand the word rational comes in many different ways. And so in this case, for example, obviously the one with the bracing would stay vertical, whereas the one that's vertical, the columns that are vertical would start to lean. And these are very interesting direct studies that we try to do in the research with the students. And you can see then if you push the other way, then obviously something happens, right? It's sort of the cause and effect of things. And I find this experiment extremely interesting. Like, how do you then start making really cool, like, strange forms, but in a very logical, rational way? And this is her study of trying to deform the model of the Sendai Media Tech column and to achieve some kind of result that is not so unlike Taichung Opera. For those who know Toyo Ito's project. And so this is an ongoing research. For example, we look into, I have been talking without forwarding these slides. My fault. So thanks. So this is the one that I was trying to say about the deformation of the Sendai Media Tech, trying to achieve something that is similar to what Ito did in Taichung, but without sort of the arbitrary imposition that actually happened in Taichung. And so this is a series of research that also done by other students in other institutions. This is Suran Zhao from Cornell. We looked into Fry Auto. and the idea of a tensile, the idea of a column, the idea of sort of bundling columns and what would happen. And then she comes up with this beautiful design of the flower canopy. And so this is the research that I'm very much interested in, refer to Scott's introduction, the interest of discovering a rational form through a logical way of looking at forces, at structure, at tectonics, and materials. And currently I'm working on, well, in the future, hopefully this will be built, working on this is in the heritage site. There are 3 colonial buildings within the site. On the north of the plan is the sea. You look into a beautiful seascape. And the south of the plan is just this mountain that kind of just is literally between the mountain and the sea. And the site is right at the tip where you see the pier coming out. There's a piece of flat land. So my proposal is to extend the landscape, take care of all the pragmatic rooms that are needed, and then create an outdoor learning space that is a canopy. So in this series of models, what I try to do is to study the density and the configuration of the columns and how the horizontal plane gets affected by the configuration in plan. And so I wanted to generate a relationship, almost a direct relationship between plan making and actually the planar condition of form making. So very simply explaining the thought behind it, and I generally try to keep things very simple. To get it to the sort of the core of the clarity. So if the columns are closer, then the plane would be flatter. And when they are spaced apart, they sag. And so through that, we did a bunch of models trying to figure out, physical models trying to figure out how to then control these series of deformation as a result of the plan. And interestingly, if you can see this image on your right, the columns, the dense columns, there are actually some that are slanted, and that's actually a result of this weight coming from the fabric of the model. So in this physical model, you can see that the columns actually shouldn't be straight because of it's reacting towards this, and so. I mean, the whole purpose of this is just try to discover if there's a way to make new plans and make new forms, and while keeping the atmospheric quality of architecture that I think is so important. And so we tried to make a series of physical models in different material. The one that you saw before was a cloth, of course, drawing references from Heinz Sisler, and other great, amazing thinkers and experiments that they've conducted. So this is one of the physical model. This is another physical model that we try to see. Then we try to work with computer model, which I think we are kind of running into challenges. And so it's an ongoing thing that we're trying to solve. I was very fortunate to work with Bryce, who's actually here, helping us with scripting the kangaroo, trying to see if gravity could be controlled and predicted. But that's kind of where we are and where we will be in the future. Thank you. Yeah.
We have about a half an hour to have a conversation. I'm going to ask if someone has a question now. I can do the launch, but I really want to be generous. And if someone has a question now, I can wait and ask mine in a bit. If somebody doesn't jump out, though, I'm going to, what'll happen. All right, I'm going to have to be the one. All right. Oh, good. We have one.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Angela, about what you said about how the atmosphere. Thank you. I was wondering, you said the atmospheric quality and how that was important to you. I'm just curious if you could speak more about that and how that's important.
This comes from a personal, I can't say that this is a right opinion, it's just a personal view or a personal critique. on looking into the work that comes from the lineage of form finding, that is, let's say, Heinz Isler, Feriato, I find that oftentimes the focus is on the tectonics and structural challenge, and therefore, it is about sort of how the joints is resolved, or how the construction is resolved. But then the way it touches the ground consistently seems problematic in terms of an architectural sort of experience. I mean, I think that's why it's important to explain my experience working with Raphael Moneo, because for me, what I learned from him is how important it is to understand space, scale, light. Those are fundamentals of architecture. And so when you have to kind of strike the balance where while you're in pursuit of your own sort of ideas, that how do you then sort of think about this through architecture? And so if you look at some of the concrete shells that Isler has done, that moment that connects to the ground is unresolved. It's resolved tectonically, structurally, but architecturally, I find it unresolved. And one could say similar comments about Otto's work as well, where the tensile structure is so much about the tensile quality of it, that it becomes, when you start to look for more, who am I to be making a comment on, Otto's work, but I look for more, and I want more. And so I guess I'm trying to bring that aspect into this. And so it's not just about, let's do some marvels and be awesome, but really, at the end, it's about the fundamentals of, I think, the architectural quality.
I'm going to jump on something. I can't help it, but there was something that happened in your last project, and in the project, Jenny, about, in your case, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to use this. The project Angela showed at the end. What's the name of this project with this one? Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
What is the project called?
It's the Titan Reservoir Reservoir Heritage Project for a kindergarten.
Okay, this project,
Yeah.
which I think really is distinguished from others you've shown today, and also the project about garment, I believe, and this was, sorry, Jenny, what was the project that showed this? This was just was this an installation? I wasn't clear about that.
It's a kind of ongoing reworking of a model, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
but
it's an installation, yeah.
Both of you then are looking at something very pliant, very contingent, I would argue, in those two. And then when I see the rest of your work, well, both of you, if I may say, in different ways, you hew very closely to a conventional repertoire, something very, either the vernacular or the structural, something like Shinohara, something that has to do with vernacular construction. In your case, vernacular type, Jenny, or that building, for example. I'm trying to understand the relationship between these two impulses, one which is very much about an economy of means and distilling something about normativity, the normative, as it were, sorry. And the other, this really, truly, what would be radical departure from that. I mean, if I may say. Do you want to comment on that, both of you?
Sure. I mean, I think so going between maybe these images, again, this is draping a facade on a building that's built, right?
Uh-huh.
And then thinking about how type and the sort of doubling, like a kind of promiscuous use of type that itself was already promiscuous, that the Boston, Redevelopment Authority decided to import this funny colonial type, garrison type. It's really just trying to figure out if there's a conversation between the central questions of domestic construction, right? Wood construction. The envelope is the kind of site that is most public, is projecting an image. It is also the site that I think needs the most examination as we think about the performance of buildings, right? I didn't mention this is also, an all-electric house, like thinking, it's solar panel ready with standing seam metal, all sorts of ideas that are these more kind of grand scale narratives about a changing climate, a changing world, and the kind of inner affect of what does it mean to misread a wood envelope as clothing, right? And are there productive scalar layering, the kind of positioning of body, of self-awareness, and for us, maybe those things are still in parallel and trying to find a place, right? That's
Okay. And Angela, what's happening in this latest piece for you?
I think even as a student, when I was at GSD, I took a course called Formalism, actually here. It was Sarah who taught that. And I've always been interested in understanding form and its meanings. That's just basically first intrinsic inclination. And I was very dissatisfied with, this is going to be going on public, no names mentioned.
No.
Okay, I was very dissatisfied with some architects at the time, their work. I thought that if you could put whatever resources you could into something, you can build anything you want. And I thought that was not very responsible. I think that architects should have a social responsibility. And when I look at, let's say, works like the Este's work, there's a desire, the Este, Eladio di Este, there's a desire to build more with less. And there's a desire to sort of discover form that actually has an inherent logic that allows structures to stand. Structure, and I meant buildings. Because ultimately, when we make buildings, it needs to stand. For me, it's really so simple. I guess the turning point, to be quite honest, was when I was working at Sana to witness that collaboration between Sasaki and Sajima Nishizawa-san, Sajima-san and Nishizawa-san. When we were doing the design development of EPFL Rolex Center, I mean, I saw those millions iterations of the curves being generated. I was part of that, generating those models. Each curve, that sort of slight inclination makes a difference. If it's higher, obviously it's more an arch form, therefore it's more efficient. And therefore the concrete would be thinner, but that wasn't, for example, programmatically, I mean, to sort of refer back to your comment, programmatically it wouldn't work because it's too steep, right? So we had to push it down, etc. And so I thought that was extremely interesting and started being really interested in whether or not there's a logical way to make meaningful form. And when I was doing the residential project, actually the way that the blocks are scattered, it counterweights each other in order to have that cantilever. We didn't just, it's a government project, it's a very limited budget. We weren't allowed to do a lot of crazy things to make that happen. So it's actually extremely rational. And so, maybe I should go back to that slide, right? And so the way that it was scattered was the way that it was configured was actually a counterweight that allowed us to do that cantilever. So to go back to this, right? So we didn't use like a lot of technology to do that, and therefore.
I'm talking about the freer form.
Right. Right. So that interest in the structure and the form became sort of from this. And then, I mean, obviously, I was very interested in Monet's essay on typology. I look at columns, I look at plans, I start questioning, and could I produce a new type of plan? It's really that simple.
I think I understand. I mean, I understand the intentions general. I think I understand generally the intentions in both of your cases with this departure from what you usually are doing in both of these particular projects that I'm paying attention to right now, looking to the future, since they seem to be the two projects that are still very much an open door that you two presented, and they have this in common, which is sort of surprising. How should I put it? It does seem like there's something else motivating it, however, than, for example, when you're making this comment of comparison. I don't see, Angela, that this would lead me to Sana, to the, that kind of project, or the one you're doing, which doesn't seem like Sana to me because it has a modulation. It does have a structural imperative built into it, but it is seemingly about, as I said, some kind of pliability almost, or expressing that at least, or at least could be subject to modifications. And in your case, Jenny, I can't help but remember my early times, and I would argue very much with Monica and Nader about their efforts to do something like what you're showing when you sketch this. I would like you, Angela, to stop. You're about to hit the slide. Keep going. I think there's a sketch of Jenny's. There, stop.
Yeah.
This really does remind me of their early efforts. It looks like you do intend perhaps to modify the shell, with either shingling or with, well, probably, maybe with clapboard, you could derive a form like this if you worked on it. But to depict this idea of a pliant facade, but then you drop it at the end. When you show this project, you're making the analogy to your piece about the garment, but I don't think you're really going to make a building with the garment, or maybe I'm missing something as far as unless you're in a different climate. I don't know what you mean with the garment, by the garment.
I think,
really.
so in my
I don't know if you mean it seriously, is how I like to say it.
Yep.
And then somebody would say to me, don't ask her to be literal, and my answer always is, we're never literal enough.
I totally agree. And I actually, so my studio this semester is about considering the occupation of a scaling up of a wall section to think about what does it mean to have part of a domestic structure in the air gap, right? So if we look at the ways in which air, vapor, insulation, glazing are all stacked together, and those things are understood as manipulable, right? They're a construction that, we could blow air into them literally, and now I could live inside of it. And so agency to be in a semi-conditioned space. Anda just had a option studio at Princeton in the fall about shoulder spaces. So looking exactly at the relationship between the conditioned interior and the semi-conditioned in-between space, right? Variations on the Lacaton Vassal winter garden, but specifically for housing, how could that both reduce our footprint of conditioned space and open up possibilities for the telegraphing of new images and characters in type. So
it's actually it's not the Nader Monica idea at all, I don't think, based on that.
Yes, because on some level, we couldn't just make the image in shingles because it's not necessarily about the image itself, it's about what the image implies. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. Okay. Michelle.
Okay.
So I'm flattered by the association, Scott.
Do you want to change subjects?
It's related, but
Sorry, I'm just going to hijack the mic for 1 second. I had a slightly different formulation of the same question, actually, that Scott asked in relation to your to what you showed, Jenny. It was very interesting to me how you combine, in a way, this extreme pragmatism, like when you describe the communal project with this community engagement, and where you almost have to come down to the level where maybe even the model would not be understood, like the most representational model might not be understood by the people you work for. You combine this extreme pragmatism with what I was totally unaware of in your work, which is this sort of reliance on the contemporary art techniques that you actually expounded on quite nicely. And I just wanted to ask you, when I look at let's say, the draping of your model, I don't, like Scott, I don't sort of jump thinking, whether this is meant to be literal or not. But what I'm thinking is that I totally recognize the conceptual art strategy. But what I'm trying to understand, and that's probably a different way of asking the same question, is how do you reconcile those two audiences? On the one hand, being so pragmatic you could work for, say, the Reba in London and be actually completely understood at that level, with the sort of work that would normally alienate this audience by suggesting that you're going to drape a puffer jacket around a building.
Yep.
They wouldn't understand it. They would have an issue with whether this is real or whether it's metaphorical. How do you manage to maintain that balance? Because your presentation seemed to be almost 50-50.
I mean, I think that's exactly it, George, and I think that's what so collective vision is literally also just Many versions and narratives can land on the same object and set of objectives, climate objectives, housing objectives, our own interest in this sort of disposition of a character that is something that's almost, unable to be spoken, but we know when we see it. So I think we need to be working through these forms of representation to be about the stories we're telling ourselves, to stay engaged with the kind of interior project, the self-directed project, and then really are beholden to the audiences that are going to get this work built, and seeing that, like the levers of zoning, or walking 70 people through how do you read the difference in these massing models that more or less could look exactly the same, right? So how do we provide language, and how do we also say that, we all read novels and watch movies, right? And the kind of construction of an imaginary world is not unfamiliar to us. So the idea that the built environment is devoid of that, I think, is just I think we could have more faith in people that occasionally everything doesn't need to be buttoned up, as long as the pragmatic stuff is satisfied, right? You can't give them all puffy jacket and no budget, no pragmatic, yeah.
I had a maybe similar line of thought. What struck me about the work and the transition to the last projects was maybe a question about your attitudes about a kind of social contract and the architecture's relationship to the environment as very different. And I see the two practices. On one hand, Jenny, the work engaging a kind of language familiar to a region as a way to critique an almost index, and thus it having to be literal for that political force to be realized. Angela, I almost see, and so sorry, that the seams, the material has to be in color. Every part has to be rendered legible as something laden with meaning. And so I think the contrasting colors and the parts and the detailings being expressed seems important. In a different way, Angela, I see a kind of environment expressed through an ineffable quality, the sort of like atmosphere, the structure as a kind of force. So the suppression of details, let's say, as a kind of structural mesh, the bending of the column, the way in which the site as environment is made known, which is also, I think, a sort of question about our surroundings, but very different senses. Does that resonate with you, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what's amazing is that I think the parallelism with totally different sensibilities, and also the and I don't think our work is like deadpan, but it sort of asks of itself to keep pushing the metaphor to be more and more literal, to see if that we can mine that for potential. So I do weirdly think that, similar to kind of the Moss practice, working through and critiquing then the sewing and the zippers, like selecting the colors, all these things are all about the sort of rhetoric for us, and how the resolution of it requires all of those decisions to matter. There's no version of it that's really is it so abstract that it has to be literal in a way? It can't really be distanced from being a literal thing.
Michelle, I love the way you frame it. Could I transcribe that and use it? Thank you. No, I mean, it's true that for me, at the end, architecture is about space and quality of space. It's about how one can engage people through the experience of it. And so therefore, again, the atmosphere is extremely important. Then how do you then generate, I want to generate a space like this where you feel the compression and you feel the release in the frame of, let's say, in this case, the ocean ahead of you, right? That's the purpose of this. And so absolutely, I think you were poetic in the way you framed it for me. Thank you.
Don't we all want to be called ineffable? Right? Unfortunately, we're just the opposite. Oh, okay. I didn't mean that so harshly. I don't know what the other term is.
Pretty sympathetic.
Yeah.
Partners in your crimes. Okay. Okay, to follow us. Sorry. We just have a few more minutes here. Just to conclude at 1:30.
It's just like a funny comment or maybe a trivial difference that I can kind of see here is like, Jenny, you kind of want the building to wear a down jacket, while Angela, you're like, it's okay if you wear the down jacket yourself. And in that sense, I'm saying like, your buildings seem much like colder and atmospheric, and I don't mean cold in like a negative way or anything like that. And then Jenny, it seems like you want people to, be comfortable in a t-shirt or in that semi-conditioned space that is that insulation layer.
It's funny because cold in Hong Kong is very hot, so you do want to kind of cool down. I think maybe that could be kind of driven by the site, actually, the climatic conditions of which we actually our practice operate. That could be, that's an interesting observation. Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially in Hong Kong. I mean, shit,
Anyway.
Yeah. Yes.
I think. Should we leave it there, Scott?
I think we're good.
Thank you.
Really, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for letting us in on your thinking and laying bare this progression. It's been great to have you here today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, sorry about that. I didn't. Get the speaker.
Thank you, Jenny.